Hey guys, tonight we're sinking into the strange and slightly disappointing world of medieval alchemists. So, if you've ever wondered what happened when someone in the Middle Ages promised they could make gold, but instead ended up with, say, a puddle of exploded mercury and a lot of excuses, this is your bedtime story. So, fluff up your pillows, dim the lights, and let's relax into some of history's weirdest broken promises. Because tonight, we're not chasing treasure, we're chasing disappointment. Now, let's begin by remembering what alchemy even was. Back then, alchemy wasn't considered complete nonsense. It was a cocktail of philosophy, proto-science, mystical vibes, and the occasional guy in a smoky basement convincing himself he was one heating away from striking it rich. The gold, the philosopher's stone, which was supposedly able to turn base metals like lead or copper into pure gold. Because of course, in the Middle Ages, people thought nature was hiding cheat codes. The appeal was obvious. Gold was money, gold was power, and rulers, who were almost always broke because wars and palaces don't pay for themselves, were absolutely obsessed with the idea that maybe, just maybe, one of these eccentric men in robes could save their economy. So, kings and dukes and bishops started sponsoring alchemists the way tech billionaires sponsor AI startups today. Imagine a medieval monarch scrolling through LinkedIn profiles of bearded men who claimed to have extensive experience in transmutation. That's basically what was happening. But here's the catch. Most alchemists, surprise, surprise, failed. No philosopher's stone, no piles of gold, just expensive experiments, weird smells, and a lot of excuses. And when you're reliving under the patronage of a king who was expecting literal mountains of treasure, failure was, let's just say, not a great career move. Let's float into one of the most famous examples. Enter Edward Kelly, a man who can only be described as the Elizabethan version of a startup scammer. Kelly was originally from England, and he didn't start off as a scientist. He actually got in trouble for counterfeiting money, already a red flag when someone claims they can make precious metals. He lost his ears as punishment. Yes, both of them, cropped right off. Which meant for the rest of his life, Kelly had to wear a hat pulled low over his head to hide the fact that he looked like he'd lost a fight with a very angry tailor. But Kelly was charming. He managed to convince another alchemist, John Dee, who was genuinely brilliant, but also really into astrology and angels, that he could talk to spirits. They teamed up because apparently when you combine one desperate dreamer with one con artist, you get chaos. Kelly told Dee that the angels were giving him the secrets of alchemy, and Dee, bless his heart, believed him. They even traveled across Europe, pitching their services to various royals like door-to-door philosophers, stone salesmen. Eventually, they landed in Bohemia, where Emperor Rudolf II, a man obsessed with occult knowledge, decided to sponsor them. Rudolf wanted gold. Kelly promised gold. This was, in retrospect, a bad match. Now, here's the thing. Kelly didn't actually have a working recipe. What he had was a clever trick. He'd take a tiny speck of real gold, secretly drop it into a crucible, and then make it look like he'd transformed a lump of lead into treasure. It was sleight of hand with molten metal. Imagine a stage magician, but instead of pulling a rabbit from a hat, he's pulling royal funding from an emperor. At first, Rudolf was impressed, but like most investors, he eventually wanted results at scale. If Kelly could make gold once, surely he could do it again, and again, and again, until the imperial treasury was overflowing. That's when Kelly started backpedaling. He needed more time, more resources, different equipment. Basically, the 16th century version of "we're still in beta testing." Rudolf wasn't amused. Eventually, Kelly was arrested and thrown in prison for failing to deliver on his promises. He tried to escape twice. On the second attempt, he injured himself so badly that he died not long after. And that, unfortunately, is what happened to one of the most famous failed alchemists. So, if you're keeping track, the lesson is, don't scam an emperor unless you enjoy rotting in a damp Bohemian dungeon. But not every alchemist was a complete fraud. Some were genuinely convinced they were onto something. The problem was, chemistry is complicated, and they were working without a periodic table, lab safety, or the slightest clue about atomic structure. Take Nicholas Flamel, who later became famous in legend as the alchemist who supposedly discovered the philosopher's stone. In reality, Flamel was a French scribe who dabbled in mystical texts. He probably never transmuted anything beyond turning his free time into ashes. Yet, centuries later, people started claiming he had unlocked eternal life. Spoiler, he hadn't, but the myth stuck, and now he pops up in everything from Harry Potter to conspiracy theories. But what if you were just a random alchemist with no connections to fame, no legends protecting your name? Well, you might end up like dozens of others who promised kings a golden miracle and instead delivered nothing. The punishments varied. Sometimes, alchemists were simply fired, sent packing, their dreams of fortune reduced to a dusty trail of failed experiments. Other times, they were jailed, tortured, or even executed for fraud. Because back then, pretending you could make gold wasn't just embarrassing, it was seen as treason against the economy. Let's move gently to another story. In the 14th century, John Damien, a Scottish alchemist, convinced King James IV of Scotland that he could not only make gold, but also fly. Because why not over pence? Damien got a ton of funding from the king. He set up experiments at Stirling Castle. He burned through resources like a kid with a chemistry set on Christmas morning. And eventually, he decided to demonstrate his genius by jumping off the castle wall with homemade wings. Shockingly, it didn't work. He survived barely but broke his leg, and instead of producing gold, he produced laughter and ridicule. The chroniclers of the time were merciless. Damien spent the rest of his life as the butt of medieval jokes. Imagine being known in history not as the man who discovered flight, but as the guy who face-planted in front of the king. That's John Damien's legacy. Now, what made all of this so enduring was that rulers wanted to believe. They wanted a shortcut to wealth. Wars were expensive. Court life was expensive. And unlike today, there was no central bank to quietly manipulate the economy. Gold was the lifeblood of royal power. So every time an alchemist showed up with a vial of strange liquid, or a cryptic book full of symbols, kings saw hope. And every time, that hope curdled into disappointment. Which brings us back to the big question. What happened to failed alchemists? Well, some were executed, some were imprisoned, some lived out quiet lives of obscurity after their patrons gave up, and a few like Kelly became cautionary tales told for centuries. But before we drift deeper into more individual disasters, let's pause and take a gentle breath. Because tonight, this isn't about chasing excitement, it's about letting the gentle absurdities of history lull us to sleep. So, as we continue, imagine the flicker of candlelight in a medieval workshop, bottles clinking softly, the faint smell of sulfur, and a man in a robe insisting that this time, for sure, he's about to make gold. Of course, he isn't, but that's what makes the story so soothing. So, we've seen Edward Kelly scam an emperor, and John Damien nosedive off a Scottish castle. But let's wander gently through a few more cases, because history is littered with alchemists who promised a little too much sparkle and ended up in the dungeon instead of the treasury. First, we'll float over to Ramon Lull. Now, Ramon Lull was a 13th century philosopher from Majorca, a man with more energy than good judgment. He was a theologian, poet, missionary, and of course an aspiring alchemist, because apparently one career wasn't enough. He believed he could use alchemy not just to make gold, but to fund crusades. Yes, crusades. Imagine pitching that to your local ruler. Give me money and materials, and I'll turn this lead into gold, which we can then use to invade Jerusalem. Sound good? Some records claim Lull actually managed to impress European monarchs with his claims. Did he succeed? Almost certainly not. What likely happened is that he spent years writing cryptic alchemical texts, filled with diagrams that looked like the doodles of a bored geometry student. Eventually, he died in relative obscurity. His later reputation as a master alchemist was more legend than fact, which, to be fair, was a pretty common theme in this business. Now, let's dim the lights a little more and step into the laboratory of George Ripley. Ripley was an English canon in the 15th century who became famous for his alchemical writings. He promised, quite boldly, that he had achieved transmutation. He even claimed he had given large sums of gold created in his lab, naturally to the Knights of St. John in Rhodes. That sounds very generous. Unfortunately, there's no evidence it ever happened. The knights themselves didn't seem to mention the mysterious pile of gold arriving by courier, which raises the question, was Ripley lying, or did he simply forget to mention that his gold supply was purely theoretical? Still, his reputation lived on. Centuries later, people were still copying his texts and pretending he knew the secret of the philosopher's stone. So Ripley avoided prison, but only because he framed his work as deeply spiritual, turning the search for gold into a metaphor for purifying the soul. Clever man, when you can't make money, make metaphors. Of course, not all rulers were so tolerant. Take Henry VI of England, who was, shall we say, not the most stable monarch in history. During his reign in the 15th century, alchemists were actively summoned to court. Henry issued licenses, allowing them to practice transmutation. That's right, he legalized alchemy, hoping that someone would actually crack the code. Spoiler, no one did. And when the inevitable disappointments rolled in, alchemists found themselves quietly vanishing from the king's favor. Some were accused of fraud, others simply faded away. Henry's reign was already a mess complete, with a nervous breakdown and the Wars of the Roses. So failed alchemists were just one more headache in a long list. Now, let's drift over to the continent, where Holy Roman emperors seemed particularly obsessed with alchemy. Rudolf II, as we've mentioned, practically collected alchemists like other people collect stamps. His court in Prague became a magnet for every dreamer with a crucible and a half-baked theory. The city filled up with astrologers, magicians, and self-proclaimed goldmakers. Imagine the atmosphere: endless experiments, strange powders bubbling in glass, and men muttering over manuscripts covered in symbols. It was basically a Renaissance version of a Silicon Valley incubator, except, instead of apps, they were pitching liquid gold. Most of them, of course, failed. Some ended up in imperial prisons. Others fled before Rudolf's patience wore out. The emperor himself, he sank deeper into obsession, surrounding himself with mystics while his empire slipped into political chaos. So, while the alchemists didn't produce gold, they did help accelerate Rudolf's reputation as an eccentric recluse, which is a legacy of sorts. Let's float for a moment on the everyday lives of these alchemists. Not all of them worked directly for kings. Many were freelancers, wandering from city to city, offering their services to whoever had money and desperation. They lived in rented workshops, usually smoky and cluttered. They dealt with dangerous substances, mercury, sulfur, arsenic, without anything resembling safety precautions. The result, many of them ended up sick, tremors, madness, or just plain poisoning. So even if you weren't arrested by your patron, there was a good chance you'd slowly poison yourself with mercury vapor. It's hard to imagine a less glamorous way to chase gold. And yet, alchemy had this allure. It wasn't only about money. It promised secret knowledge, mastery over nature, even immortality. That's why so many intellectuals dabbled in it, from Isaac Newton to Paracelsus. But the problem was always the same. Rulers didn't want metaphors or half-spiritual musings. They wanted coins. And when they didn't get coins, disappointment turned into anger. Take Giovanni Braselli, for instance. In the 15th century, this Italian alchemist convinced the ruler of Milan that he could make gold. He even staged demonstrations where metals seemed to change. But when the ruler demanded large-scale production, Braselli stalled. Eventually, he was accused of fraud, imprisoned, and tortured until he confessed that it had all been tricks. That was the risk of the trade. If you impressed your patron, you lived well. If you failed, you might not live at all. Now, let's hover over one of the stranger cases, the legend of the alchemist who turned to cannibalism. This comes from an odd tale about a man in Germany who, after repeatedly failing to produce gold, claimed he needed special ingredients. Those ingredients, he said, included human remains. Supposedly, he began grave robbing to fuel his experiments. Did it work? Obviously not. He was caught and executed. But his story became one of those cautionary tales told in hushed tones. Alchemists gone too far, quite literally digging themselves into trouble. And yet, despite all this failure, the dream persisted. Why? Because even a failed alchemist could sometimes stumble into useful discoveries. They learned how to distill liquids, how to extract chemicals, how to make pigments and dyes. In fact, alchemy slowly evolved into what we now call chemistry. So, while rulers might have been disappointed when promised gold failed to appear, society as a whole quietly benefited from all those strange experiments. Every time an alchemist blew up his workshop, humanity inched closer to actual science. But don't worry, we're not leaving the royal disasters behind. Because one of the juiciest parts of this story is just how personal rulers took these failures. For a king or emperor, being scammed by an alchemist wasn't just embarrassing, it was insulting. Imagine inviting a man into your palace, giving him money, food, and servants, and then realizing he's basically a medieval con artist with a flair for dramatic hand gestures. Some monarchs laughed it off, others threw their alchemists in dungeons, and a few, just a few, turned them into trusted advisors anyway, because when you've invested that much hope, it's hard to admit you've been duped. So, as we continue tonight, keep picturing those dimly lit workshops, those rulers leaning forward with greedy eyes, and those poor alchemists sweating over crucibles, praying their trick wouldn't be exposed. Because when the gold didn't appear, the consequences were rarely gentle. So, by now you might be noticing a pattern. An alchemist shows up, waves around some mysterious powders, makes a few bold promises, and then, nothing. No gold, no stone, just excuses. And oh, the excuses were an art form of their own. Because of course, if you've spent months reassuring a king that you'll be delivering piles of treasure, you can't just shrug and say, well, it didn't work. That's a fast track to dungeon real estate. Instead, you had to stall, to weave a story so elaborate that maybe, just maybe, your royal patron would give you another chance. One common excuse was the missing ingredient. Alchemists would insist they had everything ready. The process was perfect. But alas, they needed a rare material, something that could only be found in distant lands, or hidden monasteries, or perhaps conveniently locked in the Vatican library. This was brilliant. In a way, it bought time. While the king's agents scoured the world for unicorn horn powder or philosophical mercury, the alchemist could sit comfortably in his workshop, living off royal patronage, without having to produce any actual gold. Of course, eventually the king would notice the treasury still looked depressingly ordinary, and then the excuses ran out. But for a while, it worked. Another favorite excuse was divine timing. Alchemists claimed the stars had to align, or a certain celestial moment had to occur, before transmutation could succeed. So they'd whip out their astrological charts, point at Mars and Saturn glaring at each other across the sky, and declare, now is not the time. Which was convenient, because not the time could stretch for months or years. Rulers who were gullible or desperate sometimes bought this explanation. After all, if they already believed in astrology, why not believe that the philosopher's stone was on cosmic backdoor? And then there was the most dangerous excuse of all, blaming the ruler. Some alchemists, when cornered, insisted the process would only work if the patron himself was pure of heart, which, considering the average medieval monarch, was basically a polite way of saying, this isn't working because you're a greedy tyrant. Needless to say, that strategy rarely ended well. Let's drift into one particularly strange story. In 15th century Venice, an alchemist named Marco Bregadino, to be confused with the unlucky military commander of the same surname, claimed he could create gold through magical powders. He dazzled the Venetian Senate with demonstrations, always producing small amounts of gold that seemed to appear out of nowhere. How did he do it? Easy. He had an accomplice sneak bits of gold dust into the crucible at just the right moment. Stage magic, but with higher stakes. For a while, the Senate was impressed. They even considered using him to fund Venice's endless wars and naval expansions. But eventually, suspicions grew. When Bregadino was caught without his assistant, the trick fell apart. He was arrested, paraded as a fraud, and executed in 1591. Venice was not a forgiving place for underperforming alchemists. Now, if you're wondering why rulers kept falling for these scams, well, desperation is a powerful motivator. Medieval economies were fragile, wars drained treasuries, silver mines could run dry, and unlike today, you couldn't just print more money or adjust interest rates. Gold and silver were the foundation of everything. So when someone whispered, "I can make more," rulers were willing to suspend disbelief. Think of it like medieval venture capital. You throw money at 10 alchemists, 9 will fail miserably. But if one succeeds, even once, the payoff would be astronomical. The only problem, of course, is that success never actually came. Let's slide quietly into France, where King Charles VI, nicknamed Charles the Mad, took a keen interest in alchemy, which was, frankly, not the hobby you want for a king already prone to mental breakdowns. Charles sponsored several alchemists, convinced they might shore up his finances. But when the results failed to appear, his paranoia deepened. Some accounts suggest he believed enemies were sabotaging the experiments with curses. Others hint that he thought the failures were signs of divine punishment. In either case, the alchemists around Charles walked on very thin ice. Some were dismissed quietly, others simply vanished from records. which is historian speak for probably ended up somewhere unpleasant. Now, here's where things get a little ironic. Even though most alchemists were failing spectacularly at their main promise, turning lead into gold, they were still weirdly useful. Their experiments led to the development of distillation techniques, new medicinal concoctions, and even cosmetics. So while the king was fuming over his empty treasury, his court physicians were sneaking away with new recipes for herbal tinctures and rosewater. Basically, alchemists were inventing side hustles without meaning to, and in a sense, this saved some of them. If you couldn't deliver gold, you could at least whip up a new ointment for gout or invent a fancy purple dye. Patrons might forgive you, provided you stayed useful in other ways. Let's float gently into the Renaissance for a moment, where alchemy started to take on a more respectable flavor. Figures like Paracelsus, a Swiss physician and alchemist, argued that the real goal of alchemy wasn't making gold, but healing. He claimed that metals had medicinal properties, and he used alchemical methods to create treatments. This was a smart pivot, because while gold making was a recipe for disappointment, medicine at least had some chance of success. Even if your cure didn't work, you could always blame the disease instead of your lack of skill. But still, Paracelsus and his followers faced plenty of skepticism. To more traditional doctors, they were just quacks with fancy glassware. To kings, they were only useful if they promised treasure. And to the church, well, they were often treading dangerously close to heresy. Now, before we drift further, let's pause for a moment and picture it all. Imagine yourself in a royal palace, around the year 1500. The hallways smell faintly of incense and damp stone. You enter a small, smoky chamber lit by flickering candles. In the corner, a man in a robe stirs a bubbling mixture, muttering incantations under his breath. The king sits impatiently nearby, waiting for the glitter of gold to appear. But of course, nothing happens. Just smoke, steam, and the faint whiff of burnt lead. And the alchemist, sweating, whispers his favorite excuse. Not today, Your Majesty, but soon, very soon. So far, we've floated through excuses, scams, and a few wing-related disasters. But what really happened when patience ran out? What happened when the gold didn't appear? The excuses wore thin, and the royal temper snapped. Well, it depended on the ruler. And let's just say some kings were more forgiving than others. One of the most common outcomes was imprisonment. It was the safest way for a ruler to deal with a failed alchemist. Lock him up, throw away the key, and avoid further embarrassment. Take, for example, Edward Kelly, again the man with missing ears, who conned Emperor Rudolph II after a few too many excuses. Rudolph lost patience and tossed Kelly into a tower. The imperial logic was simple. If you really can make gold, prove it here in prison. Produce treasure and we'll let you out. Fail, and well, enjoy the view from your barred window. Kelly, of course, failed. He tried to escape twice. The second attempt ended so badly that he injured himself fatally. So yes, prison wasn't just unpleasant. It could be lethal for alchemists with too much ambition and not enough results. But sometimes rulers skipped the dungeon and went straight for public humiliation. Let's wander to Florence for a moment, where the Medici family dabbled in alchemy as much as politics and banking. They were fascinated by it, but they weren't always patient. A few unlucky alchemists, after being exposed as frauds, were paraded through the streets as examples. Nothing like a little civic shaming to discourage future scammers. The crowd would jeer, laugh, maybe throw rotten vegetables, which, frankly, was probably better than being executed. But still not the legacy you'd hope for after years of studying secret knowledge. Imagine dedicating your life to mystical science, only to be remembered as that guy everyone laughed at near the market square. Execution, though, was always on the table, especially if the alchemist's fraud was seen as a direct insult to the ruler. One of the most notorious examples is Bregadino in Venice, who we mentioned earlier. His gold trick worked for a while, but when the Senate realized they'd been duped, they didn't just imprison him, they executed him publicly, making him an example of what happens when you waste the Republic's time. Venice was a ruthless place for fraudsters, and the message was clear. You can play with fire, mercury, and sulfur all you want, but don't play with Venetian money. Now, there were also softer punishments. Some alchemists were simply dismissed, sent away quietly, their workshops dismantled, their names slowly erased from court records. For these men, failure didn't mean death, it meant obscurity. They'd wander off to another city, maybe try their luck with a different noble, and repeat the cycle until either they landed in prison or died of mercury poisoning. It was a restless, itinerant lifestyle, always promising, never delivering, always hoping the next patron would be more gullible than the last. But let's pause and talk about the strangest punishments. One story comes from the German lands in the 16th century. A failed alchemist, caught trying to pass off gilded copper as real gold, was sentenced to wear a golden-colored hat and shoes while being marched through the city. Essentially, he was turned into a walking joke, mocked for pretending he could make gold, forced to look ridiculous while everyone laughed. Humiliation was often more effective than death. It discouraged others without creating a martyr, because even a failed alchemist could sometimes inspire hope, or worse, inspire copycats. Better to turn him into a punchline than a tragic figure. Let's float gently to another angle. Sometimes rulers didn't punish at all. Why? Because they didn't want to admit they'd been fooled. If a king had invested time, money, and prestige in an alchemist, admitting the man was a fraud was embarrassing. It reflected badly on the ruler's judgment. So, instead of punishing the alchemist, the king might quietly let him slip away. This is probably what happened to dozens of minor alchemists who never made it into the history books. They failed, they disappointed, but they weren't executed, just quietly removed from court. Their names erased, their legacies reduced to a dusty footnote. And here's a sleepy irony. While most alchemists failed at their grand promises, the very fact that rulers punished them so harshly shows just how seriously alchemy was taken. It wasn't seen as a silly sideshow, it was a high-stakes enterprise. Producing gold meant wealth, power, even divine favor. Failing to produce gold meant fraud, betrayal, or even treason. In a world where kings relied on precious metals to keep armies fed and palaces warm, failure in alchemy wasn't just scientific disappointment, it was political disaster. Let's slip now into a quieter example. In the 14th century, there was an Englishman named John Dastin, who wrote to Pope John XXII claiming he had discovered the secret of transmutation. The Pope, who was already suspicious of alchemists, didn't buy it. Instead, he issued a papal bull condemning false alchemy. The punishment for fraud, according to church law: confiscation of property. No more gold making for you. Instead, the church took your books, your tools, and whatever scraps of wealth you'd managed to accumulate. So, while Dastin may have escaped the dungeon, his career and his possessions probably evaporated, which, in a way, was its own kind of slow, humiliating execution. Now, before we drift further into more examples, let's reflect for a moment on just how strange this all was. Imagine, for a moment, if modern scientists faced the same expectations. If a physicist promised a government they'd invent teleportation within 6 months, failed, and then ended up in prison. That was basically the reality of alchemists. High expectations, unrealistic promises, and punishments that ranged from a bruised ego to a noose. It was, without a doubt, one of the most stressful careers of the medieval and Renaissance world. So next time you hear someone romanticize alchemy, mystical secrets, glowing laboratories, wise old sages, remember the other side: the fear, the prisons, the humiliation. Because, for every legendary name like Flamel or Paracelsus, there were dozens of forgotten men who ended their lives not with golden treasures, but with iron shackles. So, picture this: you've convinced a duke, a king, maybe even an emperor, that you can make gold. He's given you money, food, servants, and a nice little workshop full of bubbling glassware. And now, he expects results. But of course, you can't actually turn lead into gold. No one can. So what do? You cheat. You improvise. You pull out every trick in the book to keep the illusion alive just a little longer. One of the simplest tricks was the hidden gold speck. Here's how it worked. The alchemist would stage a dramatic demonstration. Lead or copper would be placed in a crucible, heated with strange powders, and after much smoke and mumbling, the king would lean in to watch. And at the very last second, the alchemist or his assistant would drop in a tiny flake of real gold. When the metal was poured out and hammered flat, behold, the lead was now transmuted into gold. Of course, it was only a tiny amount, just enough to convince a hopeful king that the process worked, and that with more time, more money, and more patience, the alchemist could do it on a larger scale. It was the classic con, a little bait to keep the patron hooked. Another trick was hollow rods or fake crucibles. Some alchemists would prepare equipment with secret compartments filled with gold dust, so when the experiment was performed, it looked as though the gold had materialized from nothing. This was basically the 15th century version of a magic trick you'd see on a cheap stage. Only the audience was a paying crowd of villagers. It was a monarch with an army, a treasury, and a temper. High stakes, sleight of hand. Then there were the explosive distractions. If an experiment was going badly, some alchemists would deliberately cause a minor explosion, tossing in sulfur or another volatile powder. The room would fill with smoke, sparks would fly, and the alchemist would declare, the energies were too strong. We must try again another day. In other words, a controlled failure. Better to blind your patron with smoke than let him see that nothing had happened. And then we have my personal favorite, the disappearing act. Some alchemists, when cornered by angry patrons, simply ran. They packed up their tools in the dead of night, slipped out of the palace, and vanished into the countryside, hoping to find another gullible noble a few towns away. You can almost imagine the scene. The king storms into the workshop at dawn, expecting to see piles of gold, only to find empty shelves and a faint smell of burnt mercury. Meanwhile, the alchemist is halfway down the road, already rehearsing the same pitch for his next victim. Of course, not every trick was so simple. Some alchemists leaned heavily into ritual theater. They would wear elaborate robes, chant mystical phrases, and draw strange diagrams on the floor. The goal wasn't to produce gold. It was to impress, to overwhelm the patron with spectacle. If the process looked complicated enough, maybe the king wouldn't notice the lack of results. It was the medieval equivalent of overcomplicated PowerPoint slides. Confuse them with jargon, and they'll assume you know what you're doing. Now, one of the strangest scams involved alchemy powders. Some alchemists claimed they possessed a mysterious red powder, the so-called projection powder, that could transform metals instantly. They would stage demonstrations where a pinch of this powder, sprinkled over molten lead, produced a lump of gold. The trick: the powder itself contained tiny fragments of gold, or gold salts, enough to tint the mixture, enough to fool the eye. Kings and dukes were dazzled. They begged for more powder. But of course, the supply was always extremely limited. The alchemist would promise to make more soon, as long as he had more funding. Sound familiar? It's the eternal cycle of false promises. Let's slip into a story from the 17th century. There was an Italian alchemist known as Girolamo Scotto, who dazzled audiences with tricks that blurred the line between stage magic and alchemy. He performed transmutation demonstrations, conjured objects from thin air, and even staged resurrections of dead animals. People were convinced he had real power, but in truth, Scotto was a skilled magician, part illusionist, part conman. He wasn't unique. Many alchemists dabbled in showmanship, because if you can't make gold, you can at least put on a good show. And then there's the ultimate trick, using debt as a smokescreen. Some alchemists deliberately went into debt with multiple patrons at once. They'd borrow money from one noble, promising riches soon, then use part of that money to stage a flashy experiment for another noble, keeping the illusion alive. It was, essentially, the medieval version of a Ponzi scheme. As long as the flow of hopeful patrons kept coming, the illusion of success could be maintained. But once the cycle collapsed, the alchemist usually found himself either in a dungeon or on a scaffold. So, why did these tricks work for so long? Because rulers wanted to believe. They needed to believe. They were desperate for shortcuts, desperate for wealth, desperate to outshine their rivals. And when you're desperate, even the flimsiest miracle looks convincing. It wasn't just greed, it was hope. Hope that nature had a hidden secret. Hope that someone, somewhere, had found a shortcut to prosperity. And the alchemists knew how to feed that hope. Let's pause here and picture one of those demonstrations. A darkened room, a crucible glowing red-hot, a robed man sprinkling powder with trembling hands, the air thick with smoke and sulfur. The king leans forward, the courtiers whisper, and when the metal is poured, a tiny gleam of gold appears. The king's eyes widen. The alchemist bows, hiding the gold dust smeared on his sleeve, and for a little while, everyone believes. So far, we've seen alchemists with tricks, excuses, and the occasional flight attempt. But here's the real question. Why did they keep finding work? Why did alchemists, despite failing again and again, always seem to have a patron? The answer, in short, is that kings and queens were often a little too eager to believe. Let's begin with Rudolf II of the Holy Roman Empire. If you've ever wanted a perfect example of royal obsession, Rudolf is your man. He ruled from Prague in the late 16th and early 17th centuries, and he had what you might call a collector's soul. He collected art, exotic animals, curiosities, and most dangerously, alchemists. Prague under Rudolf became a magnet for every dreamer and trickster in Europe. His court was filled with laboratories, bubbling experiments, and cryptic men scribbling symbols in notebooks. Rudolf was convinced that somewhere among them was the genius who would produce the Philosopher's Stone, and he paid dearly for the privilege. He funded dozens of projects, showered money on hopefuls, and tolerated excuses far longer than most rulers would. Did it pay off? Of course not. Rudolf ended his reign bankrupt, politically isolated, and remembered more for his obsessions than his achievements. His empire was falling apart, but at least his workshop shelves were well stocked with failed experiments. Now, let's float over to England, where Elizabeth I also kept alchemists around. Elizabeth wasn't quite as gullible as Rudolf, but she was practical. She saw alchemy as a potential tool for her kingdom. If gold-making were real, England could outshine its rivals. And even if it wasn't real, alchemical experiments sometimes led to new medicines or useful chemicals. One of her most famous alchemical connections was John Dee, the scholar and advisor who dabbled in everything from astrology to angel conversations. Dee wasn't exactly a fraud. He was brilliant in mathematics and navigation, but he did keep alchemists like Edward Kelly close by. Elizabeth tolerated them, maybe even encouraged them, but she didn't throw her entire treasury at the dream. Elizabeth, in her cautious way, shows the other side of royal interest, curiosity without full-blown obsession. Now, let's drift north to James IV of Scotland, who was less cautious. James was a curious king. He dabbled in medicine, surgery, dentistry, and, yes, alchemy. He poured money into experiments at Stirling Castle. His most infamous protege was John Damian, the man who promised to make gold, but instead strapped on wings and jumped off a wall. James seemed endlessly amused by these projects, even when they failed. He wasn't as cruel as some rulers. Damian lived to limp another day, but he represents that royal itch for wonder, a monarch who saw alchemy as entertainment as much as science. And then we have Charles VI of France, also known as Charles the Mad. Charles had enough mental health struggles without dabbling in alchemy, but he did anyway. Like many rulers in crisis, he saw alchemy as a lifeline. France was battered by war and debt. What better solution than a steady supply of homemade gold? But of course, the alchemists disappointed him. Charles grew paranoid, convinced enemies were sabotaging his court. His reliance on mystical solutions only deepened the sense of chaos around him. For alchemists at his court, it was a dangerous atmosphere. One wrong move, and you might be accused of treason or witchcraft. Let's not forget the popes. Yes, even the papacy dipped its toes into alchemy. Several popes kept alchemists at court, curious about the potential for wealth. Pope John XXII, in particular, was deeply suspicious of false alchemy. He issued a bull condemning frauds, but at the same time, he kept dabbling with the idea himself. It's the perfect contradiction, condemning alchemy as heresy, while secretly hoping it might work. After all, even the church needed money. But if we're talking about gullible rulers, one name keeps coming back: Philip II of Spain. Philip was a man obsessed with control, order, and power. He oversaw the vast Spanish Empire at its height, but his endless wars drained the treasury. And so, like many rulers before him, he turned to alchemists. Philip funded secret laboratories, hoping to find a shortcut to wealth. He even gave some alchemists protection from the Inquisition, shielding them so they could continue their work. And yet, nothing. Spain remained bankrupt. Philip remained frustrated, and the dream of golden transmutation slipped further away. There's a certain irony here. These rulers commanded armies, ruled nations, and held absolute power over millions of people. Yet, in the privacy of their courts, they placed their hopes in men with strange powders and smoky crucibles. They believed in whispered promises and stage tricks, all because they wanted to believe that wealth could appear from nowhere. It was, in a sense, the great royal bedtime story, the comforting fantasy that there was a secret, hidden shortcut, that maybe, just maybe, gold could be made by hand. And that belief kept alchemists in business, because as long as kings dreamed of endless treasure, there would always be a man ready to sell them. A vial of red powder, a book of cryptic symbols, and a promise that the miracle was just one more experiment away. If you think promising to make gold out of lead was ambitious, wait until you hear what else alchemists were selling. Because somewhere along the line, alchemy split into two dreams. On one side was transmutation, the philosopher's stone, the glittering piles of treasure that kept kings drooling, and on the other side was medicine, the idea that alchemy could produce an elixir of life, a universal cure, or even a potion for immortality. And in some ways, this second dream was even more dangerous. Let's start in China, because the pursuit of immortality there makes European gold chasing look almost modest. Chinese alchemists, working under emperors who absolutely did not want to die, developed formulas for elixirs that promised eternal life. The tragic punchline: many of these formulas were loaded with mercury, arsenic, and lead. So, in their attempts to avoid death, emperors basically poisoned themselves. For example, Emperor Qin Shi Huang, the man who unified China, built huge chunks of the Great Wall and left behind the Terracotta Army. Also left behind a trail of mercury pills. He consumed them regularly, believing they would grant him immortality. Instead, they likely worsened his health and hastened his death. Centuries later, the pattern repeated. Emperor Jiajing of the Ming dynasty drank potions made of crushed pearls and gold. Because, of course, if you can't wear wealth, why not swallow it? His health declined steadily, as did that of many others who trusted these glittering brews. So while European kings bankrupted themselves chasing gold, Chinese emperors were quietly drinking themselves to death in pursuit of forever. Back in Europe, immortality wasn't quite as fashionable as wealth, but plenty of alchemists promised miracle cures. One infamous example is Paracelsus, a brilliant, eccentric physician alchemist of the 16th century. Paracelsus didn't claim he could live forever, but he did believe alchemy could produce a universal medicine, something that could heal all illnesses. He was entirely wrong. Some of his experiments with chemicals laid the groundwork for modern medicine, but he also believed in strange theories about body, spirits, and cosmic influences. The result was a mix of genuine insight and complete nonsense, served up with equal confidence. Paracelsus is remembered today as both a pioneer and a quack, which is a fitting description of alchemy itself, really. Now, let's drift into the stranger corners of experimentation. Some alchemists went beyond potions and powders. They tried to create life. Yes, really. One of the strangest legends in alchemical history is the homunculus. According to the story, alchemists believed they could create tiny human beings in flasks. The recipe, and I promise I am not making this up, often involved placing human semen into a sealed container with various chemicals, then incubating it under special conditions. After a set number of days, the alchemists supposedly opened the flask to reveal a tiny human-like creature. Did it ever work? Absolutely not. But the fact that serious scholars even entertained this idea shows how blurred the line was between science, mysticism, and wishful thinking. The homunculus became a kind of alchemical mascot, a symbol of humanity's urge to control and replicate nature. Today, it just sounds like the plot of a very questionable fantasy novel. And then we have the experiments with animals. Alchemy was in tea, just about gold and potions. Sometimes it was about testing substances on anything that moved. Dogs, birds, frogs, you name it. Someone probably smeared mercury on it. One grim story comes from the quest for the philosopher's stone, which some alchemists believed could resurrect the dead. To prove their powders worked, they allegedly killed small animals and tried to revive them with alchemical concoctions. Needless to say, the results were not positive. The animals stayed dead, the powders were wasted, and the alchemist had one fewer pet pigeon. But perhaps the most dangerous of all experiments were the ones involving explosives. Alchemy often required heating strange powders and mixing volatile substances. Accidents were inevitable. Entire workshops went up in flames. Alchemists lost their sight, their hands, sometimes their lives. One particularly famous casualty was Basil Valentine, a legendary and possibly mythical alchemist credited with discovering antimony. His writings describe dramatic explosions, fiery accidents, and the constant danger of handling substances no one fully understood. In truth, many alchemists probably blew up their labs trying to impress patrons. A fiery explosion could be explained as a necessary step in the great work. But in reality, it was just another failed experiment with sulfur and saltpeter. If we zoom out a little, what we see is this. Alchemy wasn't just about greed, it was also about fear. Fear of death, fear of sickness, fear of human limits. People wanted wealth, yes, but they also wanted health, vitality, and power over the natural world. Alchemists, with their bubbling flasks and cryptic formulas, seemed like the only ones who might provide that. And so kings drank mercury, nobles swallowed crushed gems, and everyday people bought elixirs that did more harm than good, all in the hope that maybe, just maybe, they could push back against time itself. The tragic irony is that, in chasing life, many alchemists delivered death, and in chasing gold, they often delivered only smoke. Yet the dream lived on, century after century, because even when the failures piled high, the hope was too sweet to abandon. By the late 16th and 17th centuries, alchemy had been around for centuries. It had filled libraries, workshops, and royal courts. It had burned through fortunes, sparked explosions, and sent countless alchemists running for their lives. And yet, somehow, the dream lingered. It lingered because there was always one more hope, one more formula, one more man in a robe who swore he'd cracked the secret. But over time, cracks started to show, and those cracks became harder and harder to cover. The first major crack came in the form of public fraud trials. By the 1600s, the word was out. Too many nobles had been tricked, too much money wasted. Governments began cracking down on alchemists who promised gold and failed to deliver. In France, Italy, and the Holy Roman Empire, you could be dragged to court for false transmutation. One case in Paris involved an alchemist who had dazzled investors with tiny nuggets of gold, supposedly created from lead. When the fraud was exposed, he wasn't just fined, he was humiliated in public, paraded through the streets as a warning. His tools were smashed, his books burned, and his reputation reduced to ash, because by then, it wasn't just about money, it was about pride. Kings and nobles didn't like being duped, and when powerful men feel embarrassed, someone has to pay. Other alchemists faced harsher fates. Imprisonment was common. If you promised gold and failed, you might find yourself in a dungeon, still ordered to keep working. Of course, some rulers weren't ready to give up entirely. They just decided their alchemists should experiment under lock and key. This happened to several hopefuls in the courts of Spain and Germany. Locked away in towers, they scribbled formulas by candlelight, insisting they were close to success. Some even convinced their captors to keep funding them. Others simply faded away, forgotten in the stone walls. In a strange way, the dungeon was the ultimate laboratory lease. You couldn't run, you couldn't hide, and you certainly couldn't ask for more money from rival nobles. But for all the fraud and punishment, there was also a gentler transformation happening. Slowly, piece by piece, alchemy began to evolve into chemistry. Because not every alchemist was a fraud. Some were careful experimenters. Some made genuine discoveries. Not gold, not immortality, but new substances, new reactions, new techniques. Distillation, crystallization, acid experiments, metallurgy. These all came out of alchemical practice. Alchemists may have been chasing impossible dreams, but along the way, they stumbled into real science. For example, Johann Glauber in the 17th century produced compounds like sodium sulfate, which became useful in medicine and industry. Robert Boyle, one of the founders of modern chemistry, began his career steeped in alchemical tradition. Even Isaac Newton, the poster child of scientific genius, spent an astonishing amount of time scribbling about alchemy in secret. So while alchemy failed at its main goal, it left behind tools and knowledge that paved the way for the Enlightenment. But let's not get too rosy. For the everyday alchemist, the decline of belief meant a harsher reality. Without gullible patrons, many turned to other trades. Some became apothecaries, selling herbal remedies instead of miracle powders. Others slipped into the growing world of early chemistry, rebranding themselves as natural philosophers. And others, well, they simply vanished, their names lost, their grand promises forgotten. One of the most symbolic endings came in the 18th century, when governments across Europe began officially banning transmutation claims. The Holy Roman Emperor Francis I outlawed the practice in the 1700s, declaring that no one was allowed to claim they could make gold. In France, similar laws shut down the last generation of public alchemists. At that point, alchemy wasn't just failing, it was embarrassing. It was seen as a relic, an old superstition, a childish dream that serious men no longer entertained. The age of the laboratory was arriving, and in those new, cleaner rooms, there was no place for smoky robes and muttered charms. But here's the thing. Alchemy never truly died. The dream of transmutation stayed alive in quiet corners, whispered in books and secret societies. Freemasons, Rosicrucians, and other mystical groups kept the symbols and language of alchemy alive, long after scientists had moved on. They spoke not of literal gold, but of spiritual gold, the transformation of the soul, the perfection of the self. So even as real alchemy faded from royal courts, its ghost lived on, and in some ways, it still lingers today. Anytime you hear someone talk about turning lead into gold as a metaphor, or when you see a fantasy story with alchemists tinkering away, that's the echo of a dream that never quite let go. Let's imagine, for a moment, that final scene. A dusty laboratory in the 1700s, an old man bent over a table, scribbling notes by candlelight. His shelves are full of broken flasks, his hands scarred from burns. Outside, the world is moving on, factories rising, science gaining ground. But inside, he still whispers to himself, still stares at the metals, hoping they'll change, still clings to the idea that after all this time, the secret might reveal itself. It never does, but he dies believing it might have been possible. And in a way, that was always the story of alchemy. Even after the last royal patron shut the last smoky laboratory, alchemy refused to vanish completely. It's one of those ideas that clings to the human imagination, like a stain that never quite washes out. Because alchemy wasn't just about lead and gold, it was about the dream of change, the belief that nothing in the world is fixed, that everything can be transformed. And that idea is harder to kill than any single fraud or failed experiment. Let's start with the scientific legacy. While alchemy itself failed, the tools, the habits, and even the stubborn patience of alchemists laid foundations for modern science. Distillation, sublimation, acid work, alloys, all of these came out of alchemical workshops. When Robert Boyle wrote The Skeptical Chemist in 1661, he was drawing a line in the sand, away from mystical speculation, toward precise observation and repeatable experiments. Boyle is remembered as a founder of chemistry, but in truth, he was just building a stricter frame around the messy playground alchemists had already built. Isaac Newton, meanwhile, secretly filled notebook after notebook with alchemical scribbles. He obsessed over coded texts, strange symbols, and recipes for the Philosopher's Stone. Today we remember him for calculus and gravity, but in his own mind, alchemy was just as important. He believed nature still had hidden laws, waiting to be unlocked. So while alchemy was ridiculed by the Enlightenment, it also quietly fed into it. Science was born not in a clean break, but in a slow, smoky transition. But the cultural legacy is just as strong. Alchemy became a rich metaphor. Writers and poets turned it into a symbol of inner change. To transmute lead into gold became a way of describing the transformation of the soul. Ignorance into wisdom, weakness into strength, despair into hope. In the 19th century, Romantic writers embraced alchemy's imagery. Goethe, for instance, wove alchemical ideas into Faust, where the pursuit of knowledge and power takes on both mystical and dangerous forms. Even today, when someone talks about alchemy in art, or music, or love, they don't mean literal furnaces and mercury. They mean transformation. They mean the hope that something base can be turned into something precious. And then there's alchemy in fiction. Fantasy novels, movies, and games still lean heavily on the image of the alchemist, the eccentric figure in robes, hunched over flasks, muttering over glowing liquids. Think of Nicholas Flamel in Harry Potter, or the entire world of Fullmetal Alchemist. Even if you've never read a word of Paracelsus or Basil Valentine, you probably know what an alchemist is supposed to look like. That image comes not from the real, messy history, but from the cultural memory, from centuries of fascination, fear, and wonder. There's also a stranger, quieter legacy, the spiritual alchemists. Long after practical alchemy faded, mystical groups like the Rosicrucians and Freemasons kept its symbols alive. For them, alchemy wasn't about turning metals into gold. It was about turning the self into something higher. The furnace became the human heart. The philosopher's stone became enlightenment. The long, difficult process of transmutation became the soul's journey toward perfection. These groups helped keep alchemy alive, not as science, but as philosophy. Even today, if you wander into the stranger corners of occult bookstores, you'll find shelves lined with alchemical symbols, all reinterpreted as metaphors for inner change. And maybe that's the real secret. Alchemy survived because it was never really about gold. Not deep down. Gold was just the hook, the glittering bait to lure kings, emperors, and anyone else desperate enough to believe. But behind the frauds and the failures, there was always that whisper, that things can change, that what looks worthless might hide something precious, that life is not fixed, but transformable. And that whisper was enough to keep people dreaming for centuries. So tonight, as we let this long story wind down, let's imagine one last scene. Not a king in his gilded chamber, or an alchemist with powders hidden up his sleeve, but a quiet workshop, late at night. A man leans over a flickering lamp, scribbling notes in a language no one else will ever read. His furnace hums softly, a crucible glowing in the dark. He whispers to himself, convinced that the secret is close, just one more experiment away. Of course, the gold never comes. The miracle never arrives. But still, he dreams. And maybe that's the real alchemy. Not the gold, not the stone. Just the endless, restless human urge to believe that change is always possible.